The unlikely encounter. The human, Ethan Carter, stepped cautiously through the dense jungle of the alien planet Varnus 3. His advanced survival suit beeped softly, warning him of the hazardous environment. Varnus 3 was known as a primitive and dangerous world, a place where predators ruled, and survival was never guaranteed. Ethan wasn't supposed to be here. His ship had been damaged during a hyperspace jump, forcing him to crash land on this hostile planet. Sweat trickled down his face as he navigated the terrain. Gigantic alien trees loomed overhead, their glowing leaves casting an eerie green light. Strange sounds echoed all around him. Growls, clicks, and the distant roar of something massive. Every shadow felt like a threat. Ethan clutched his plasma pistol tightly, his eyes scanning the jungle for movement. He had to find shelter before nightfall. On this planet, darkness meant death. As he pressed forward, Ethan's suit detected faint heat signatures ahead. Intrigued and wary, he crouched low and followed the signal. After a few minutes, he reached a clearing and froze. In the distance, he saw a camp surrounded by crude barricades made of bones and scrap metal. Torches burned brightly, casting flickering light on a group of aliens. These weren't the friendly kind. They were brutish and savage, with rough, scaly skin and sharp claws. They roared and laughed around a central fire, where they seemed to be celebrating something or someone. Ethan's suit zoomed in on the scene, and what he saw made his stomach twist. At the center of the camp, bound in chains, was a figure unlike the others. She was tall, with silver-blue skin that shimmered faintly in the torchlight. Her features were regal, her posture defiant despite her restraints. Her violet eyes burned with anger, but there was an unmistakable sadness in them. She was different from the savages surrounding her, refined, almost noble. Ethan's suit analyzed her physiology and flagged her as a member of the Zenari species, a highly advanced race known for their intelligence and leadership within the galaxy. Why would a Zenari be here? Ethan muttered to himself. The Zenari were a proud people, rulers of entire star systems. To see one here on a primitive world like Varnus 3 was unthinkable. But there she was, clearly a prisoner of these barbaric aliens. Ethan's thoughts raced. He could turn back and avoid getting involved. This wasn't his fight. His priority was to survive and find a way off the planet. But as he watched the alien queen struggle against her chains, something stirred inside him. She wasn't just a prisoner. She was being humiliated, treated as a trophy by creatures far beneath her. The savages shouted and jeered, waving crude weapons in the air. One of them even struck her, and though she didn't cry out, Ethan saw the pain flash across her face. He clenched his fists. Walking away wasn't an option anymore. Ethan retreated a few steps into the jungle, formulating a plan. His training as an explorer had taught him how to think quickly and adapt, but this was a new kind of challenge. The camp was heavily guarded, with at least 24 armed aliens. He couldn't take them head-on, but perhaps he didn't need to. His suit's sensors identified weak points in the camp's defenses, a gap in the barricades on the north side, and a poorly guarded supply area. If he could create a distraction, he might have a chance to get her out. He checked his equipment, a plasma pistol with limited energy, a small EMP grenade, and a knife. Not much, but it would have to do. He also had his suit's cloaking ability, though it could only last for short bursts. Taking a deep breath, Ethan began moving toward the camp's weak point. As he crept closer, he couldn't help but glance at the alien queen again. Even in chains, she held an air of authority. Her eyes scanned her surroundings, calculating, waiting for an opportunity. Ethan admired her strength. It was clear she hadn't given up, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Suddenly, a loud roar erupted from the jungle behind him. Ethan froze. Something huge was approaching the camp, its heavy footsteps shaking the ground. The savages turned toward the noise, grabbing their weapons. A massive predator emerged from the shadows. A six-legged beast with razor-sharp teeth and glowing red eyes. It snarled and charged toward the camp, drawn by the smell of food. Ethan's heart raced. The distraction he needed had arrived, though not by his own design. The camp erupted into chaos as the savages scrambled to defend themselves. The predator smashed through the barricades, scattering debris and roaring furiously. Ethan activated his suit's cloaking device and slipped into the camp amidst the chaos. Staying low, he made his way to the queen. Up close, she looked even more striking. Her silver-blue skin shimmered like starlight, and her eyes locked onto him with a mix of surprise and suspicion. Ethan placed a finger to his lips, signaling her to stay quiet. "Don't worry," he whispered. "I'm getting you out of here." Her gaze softened, and she gave a small nod. Ethan quickly worked on the chains binding her, using his knife and suit's tools to free her wrists. The queen winced, but didn't make a sound. As the last chain fell away, she stood tall, rubbing her sore wrists. The roar of the predator reminded them both that they weren't safe yet. The savages were still fighting the beast, but it wouldn't be long before they noticed the queen's absence. Ethan motioned for her to follow him, and together they slipped into the shadows of the jungle. For now, they were free, but the real danger was only beginning. The dangerous plan. Ethan and the queen moved silently through the dense jungle, the glow of distant fires from the camp still visible behind them. The queen's breathing was steady, but Ethan could see her exhaustion. She didn't complain, didn't falter. This was a woman accustomed to carrying burdens far heavier than chains. After several minutes, Ethan signaled for them to stop. They crouched behind a cluster of alien ferns, their bioluminescent leaves casting faint blue light on their faces. The queen studied him, her violet eyes piercing and sharp. "You're human," she said softly, her voice carrying a mix of authority and curiosity. It wasn't a question, but a statement, as though she were piecing together a puzzle. Ethan nodded. "That's right. And you're Zenari. What's a queen doing on a death trap like this?" The queen hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. "A coup," she said at last, her tone clipped. "Traitors in my court allied with mercenaries. They overthrew my rule and sold me to the highest bidder. The primitives here bought me as a prize." Ethan clenched his fists. He'd heard of political betrayals, but seeing the consequences firsthand ignited a spark of anger. "Well, you're not their trophy anymore. But we're not out of danger yet." The queen's lips curled into a faint smile, but there was no warmth in it. "You're bold, human. I'll give you that. But do you have a plan? Or is your courage the only thing keeping us alive?" Ethan chuckled softly, though his mind was racing. He had to keep her calm and focused, but the truth was, their odds weren't great. The jungle was vast, filled with predators, and the savages wouldn't give up their prize easily. They had to stay ahead of the search parties and find a way off this planet. "My ship crashed not far from here," Ethan said. "It's damaged, but the emergency beacon might still work. If we can send a signal, we might attract a rescue. But getting there won't be easy." The queen tilted her head, considering. "Do you have weapons? Supplies?" Ethan patted his suit. "Not much. A pistol, a knife, and one EMP grenade. Enough to cause some trouble, but not enough for a war." The queen's gaze hardened. "Then we'll have to be clever." Ethan nodded. "Exactly. First, we need to create a diversion. The savages will be hunting us by now. If we lead them in the wrong direction, we might buy enough time to reach my ship." The queen raised an eyebrow. "You're assuming they're foolish enough to fall for such a trick." "They're primitives," Ethan replied. "They don't know how humans think. That's our advantage." She studied him for a moment, then gave a single nod. "Very well. What do you need me to do?" Ethan was struck by her composure. Despite everything she'd endured, she didn't waver. It was clear why she was a queen. She carried herself with a strength that demanded respect. "First, we set a trap," Ethan said. "There's a clearing nearby. If we leave false tracks leading there and rig the area with the EMP grenade, it should create enough chaos to slow them down." And while they're distracted, we move toward your ship, the Queen finished. Her lips curved into a faint smirk. Clever indeed, human. They set to work quickly. Ethan showed the Queen how to use the knife to carve false tracks into the soft ground, creating the illusion of a struggle. Meanwhile, he rigged the EMP grenade to detonate remotely, positioning it in the center of the clearing. The Queen, despite her regal bearing, proved adept at the task. Her movements were precise, her focus unwavering. As they worked, Ethan found himself impressed by her resilience. Most people in her position would have broken down, but she seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Every rustle in the jungle felt like the approach of their pursuers. When the trap was set, Ethan and the Queen retreated into the shadows, hiding in the undergrowth. It wasn't long before the savages arrived, their guttural voices echoing through the trees. They followed the false tracks into the clearing, their crude weapons raised. Ethan held his breath, his finger hovering over the detonator. "Wait for it," he whispered to the Queen. The savages moved deeper into the clearing, their leader barking orders. Ethan could see the confusion on their faces as they searched for signs of their quarry. When the last of them stepped into the trap, he pressed the button. The EMP grenade detonated with a flash of blinding light and a deafening crack. The savages screamed as their crude electronic devices sparked and failed, their weapons rendered useless. The chaos was immediate. Some of the aliens panicked and fled, while others stumbled around, disoriented. "Now," Ethan hissed. He and the Queen slipped away, moving quickly but silently through the jungle. The sounds of confusion and anger faded behind them as they put distance between themselves and the clearing. Ethan's heart pounded, but he didn't let up. He knew the distraction wouldn't last forever. After what felt like hours, they'd reached a ridge overlooking a valley. In the distance, Ethan's crashed ship gleamed faintly in the moonlight. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. The savages would regroup soon, and they'd have to fight for every step to reach that ship. "This is just the beginning," Ethan said, glancing at the Queen. "You ready for what's next?" The Queen straightened, her violet eyes blazing with determination. "I've survived worse, human. Lead the way." With that, they descended into the valley, their path fraught with danger, but their resolve unshaken. The escape and pursuit. Ethan and the Queen descended into the valley cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the soft, alien foliage. The crashed ship stood as a jagged silhouette in the moonlight, its metallic hull reflecting faint silver hues. Though damaged, it was their only hope for escape. But the savages were relentless hunters, and Ethan knew they would soon pick up the trail. The Queen paused for a moment, her sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. "How far is the ship from here?" she asked, her voice low but steady. "About half a mile," Ethan replied, his voice equally hushed. "But it's not just about getting there. We'll need time to power up the emergency systems and send a signal." "Time we don't have," she said, a note of urgency creeping into her tone. Ethan couldn't argue. The savages were known for their brutal efficiency, even if their methods were primitive. They had the advantage of numbers and terrain familiarity. Ethan and the Queen, despite their skills and determination, were two against an entire horde. As they reached a denser part of the valley, the sound of distant drums echoed through the night. Ethan froze, his instincts screaming danger. The Queen's expression tightened. "They found the false trail," she murmured. "It won't be long before they realize we're not there." Ethan nodded. "We need to move faster." But faster wasn't an option. The valley's terrain was uneven, with jagged rocks and dense undergrowth slowing their progress. To make matters worse, the sound of the drums grew louder, accompanied by the guttural cries of the hunters. They weren't just tracking, they were announcing their intent to kill. "We need another diversion," Ethan said, scanning their surroundings. His eyes fell on a cluster of strange, glowing plants nearby. Their vibrant, pulsating light gave him an idea. "Help me with this." The Queen raised an eyebrow, but didn't question him. Together, they gathered the glowing plants, careful not to crush their fragile stems. Ethan arranged them in a pattern along a narrow path leading deeper into the valley, making it look like a deliberate trail. He added some of the Queen's shredded cloak to the path, creating a decoy. "Will this really fool them?" she asked, her tone skeptical. Ethan grinned. "They're not exactly geniuses. It'll buy us a few minutes at least." With the decoy in place, they continued toward the ship, their pace quickened by the renewed urgency. The drums faded momentarily, giving them a glimmer of hope. But it was short-lived. A distant howl shattered the silence, followed by the unmistakable sound of pursuit. "They split up," the Queen said, her voice grim. "They're closing in from multiple directions." Ethan cursed under his breath. They were out of tricks, and time was running out. The ship was still several hundred yards away, its bulk now visible through the thinning trees. The terrain flattened slightly, making it easier to run, but also leaving them more exposed. "We're going to have to make a stand," Ethan said, stopping to catch his breath. He drew his plasma pistol and handed the knife to the Queen. "If they reach us before we get to the ship, we're done." The Queen accepted the knife without hesitation, her grip steady. "Then we fight." They took cover behind a cluster of boulders, their breathing heavy but controlled. The first wave of hunters appeared moments later, their torches flickering in the darkness. Ethan counted at least 6, their snarling voices and crude weapons signaling their bloodlust. Ethan fired the first shot, the plasma bolt lighting up the night as it struck one of the hunters. The savage collapsed with a guttural scream, sending the others into a frenzy. The Queen leaped into action, her movements swift and precise. Despite her lack of weaponry, she wielded the knife with deadly efficiency, disarming one of the attackers and using his own weapon against him. The battle was chaotic and brutal. Ethan's plasma pistol hummed with each shot, but the energy reserves were dwindling. The Queen fought with a ferocity that belied her regal appearance, her violet eyes blazing with determination. Together, they managed to drive off the first wave, but more were coming. The drums grew louder, the cries of the hunters more frenzied. "We can't hold them off much longer," Ethan said, his voice strained. He glanced toward the ship, now tantalizingly close. "We have to run." The Queen nodded, blood streaking her silver-blue skin, but her expression resolute. "Then let's go." They broke cover and sprinted toward the ship, their breaths ragged and hearts pounding. The savages gave chase, their roars echoing through the valley. Ethan could feel the weight of their pursuit, the ground shaking with the force of their charge. When they finally reached the ship, Ethan wasted no time. He slammed his hand against the control panel, praying the emergency systems still had power. The hatch groaned open, its mechanisms barely functional. He turned to the Queen. "Inside." "Now." She didn't hesitate, darting into the ship as Ethan fired a few last shots to hold off the advancing horde. The savages were dangerously close now, their torches illuminating their snarling faces. Ethan dived inside just as the first of them reached the hatch. He slammed the control panel, and the hatch began to close. One of the hunters tried to wedge his weapon into the gap, but the Queen struck it away with a feral precision, slamming the knife into the alien's hand. The hatch sealed with a final hiss, cutting off the roars of the attackers. Inside the dimly lit cabin, both Ethan and the Queen collapsed against the walls, their chests heaving. The ship's emergency lights flickered, casting eerie shadows. For a moment, neither spoke, the reality of their narrow escape sinking in. "We're not safe yet," Ethan said, breaking the silence. "They'll try to breach the ship. We need to get the systems online." The Queen nodded, her face calm despite the chaos. "Then let's not waste time." As Ethan moved to the control console, the Queen stood guard, her knife still in hand. The savages' roars echoed faintly outside, a chilling reminder that their fight was far from over. The planet's trials. The battered ship groaned as Ethan powered up its emergency systems, the dim glow of flickering lights filling the cramped cabin. The Queen stood by the sealed hatch, her violet eyes watching the door with unflinching focus. Outside, the savages' roars grew louder, accompanied by the rhythmic pounding of makeshift weapons against the hull. Time was slipping away. "We don't have much left in terms of power," Ethan muttered, his fingers flying over the console. "Most of the systems are fried. The distress signal's our best shot, but even that's a long shot." The Queen glanced at him, her regal composure unwavering despite the chaos. "Send the signal. If my people receive it, they will come." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "And if they don't?" Her expression hardened. "Then we die fighting. But we will not let them take us." The determination in her voice sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. This wasn't just a queen. She was a warrior, a survivor. He nodded and activated the beacon, praying it would reach someone. Anyone, before it was too late. Suddenly, the ship shuddered as something heavy struck the hull. The savages were trying to breach the door, their guttural growls and laughter echoing through the cabin. Ethan grabbed his plasma pistol, though its energy reserves were nearly depleted. "They're not going to stop," he said grimly. "We need to buy ourselves some time." The Queen stepped forward, her knife gleaming in the faint light. "This ship is your domain. Show me what a human can do to defend it." Ethan smirked despite the gravity of the situation. "All right, Your Highness. Let's give them a proper human welcome." He led her to the cargo bay, where a few emergency supplies were still intact. Rummaging through the crates, he found a handful of explosive charges, small but powerful enough to create a lethal barrier. He handed one to the Queen, who examined it with keen interest. "Set these near the entrance," he instructed. "If they get through the door, we'll give them a surprise they won't forget." As they worked together to rig the explosives, Ethan couldn't help but admire the Queen's efficiency. She moved with a grace that belied her strength, her hands steady even as the savages' pounding grew louder. Despite her regal demeanor, there was no hesitation, no fear. "Why did you help me?" she asked suddenly, her voice soft but piercing. Ethan paused, considering the question. "Because it was the right thing to do." She tilted her head, studying him. "Even though it risked your life?" He shrugged. "Guess humans are just stubborn like that." A faint smile touched her lips, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "You're a strange species, Ethan Carter, but perhaps not as primitive as I thought." Before he could respond, the ship groaned again, this time louder. The pounding had stopped, replaced by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the hull. Ethan's blood ran cold. "They're bringing something bigger," he said, "probably a battering ram. We don't have much time." The Queen nodded, her expression turning steely. "Then we make every second count." They returned to the main cabin just as the first impact hit the door. The entire ship shuddered, dust falling from the ceiling. Ethan aimed his pistol at the hatch, though he knew it wouldn't hold for long. "Get ready," he said, his voice tight. "When that door comes down, we light them up." The Queen stood beside him, her knife in one hand and a makeshift spear in the other. Despite the tension, there was a calmness about her, a quiet strength that steadied Ethan's nerves. The next impact was even stronger, and a crack appeared in the metal. The savages outside roared in triumph, their victory seemingly within reach. Ethan glanced at the Queen, who met his gaze with a slight nod. Then the battering ram struck again, and the door buckled. Before the savages could breach it fully, Ethan activated the explosives. The charges detonated with a deafening roar, shaking the entire ship. The savages' cries of triumph turned to screams of pain as the explosion tore through the entryway, sending debris and bodies flying. When the smoke cleared, the silence was deafening. Ethan and the Queen exchanged a glance, both of them breathing heavily. But the victory was short-lived. Through the broken doorway, they could see more torches approaching in the distance. "They won't stop," the Queen said grimly. "Not until we're dead." Ethan clenched his jaw. "Then we keep fighting. They'll have to earn it." But as he spoke, the console behind them beeped. A faint light flickered on the display. A signal had been received. "Someone heard us," Ethan said, his voice tinged with hope. The beacon worked. The Queen's eyes lit up, but she quickly turned her attention back to the approaching savages. "How long until they arrive?" Ethan checked the console. "Too long. We'll have to hold out until then." The Queen tightened her grip on her weapons. "Then let us make them regret ever coming after us." Together, they prepared for the next wave, the weight of survival resting heavily on their shoulders. The trials of the planet were far from over, but neither Ethan nor the Queen was ready to give up. They were determined to fight, to endure, and to survive, no matter the cost. Turning the tide. The cabin of the ship was eerily quiet after the explosion, save for the soft hum of the emergency systems. Ethan's heart raced as he leaned against the wall, reloading his plasma pistol with the last of its energy reserves. The Queen, ever composed, crouched near the breached hatch, her knife gleaming in her grip. Outside, the jungle pulsed with the low murmurs of savages regrouping, their torchlight flickering ominously through the cracks. "How many charges do we have left?" the Queen asked, her voice calm but edged with urgency. "That was the last of them," Ethan admitted. "We're out of tricks, out of ammo, and running out of time." The Queen didn't flinch. Instead, she nodded toward the faint signal indicator on the console. "But we have hope. Whoever received that signal, they're coming. We just need to survive until then." Ethan smirked despite the grim situation. Survive. On this planet. Piece of cake. The Queen didn't laugh, but her sharp glance carried a flicker of amusement. "You humans have an odd way of finding humor in certain death." Before Ethan could respond, the faint sound of movement outside caught their attention. The savages were approaching again, their guttural voices rising in anticipation. Ethan peeked through the shattered hatch. This time, they were more organized, moving in tight formations with crude shields and spears. At the center of the group was a towering figure, likely their leader, clad in a patchwork of bones and metal. "They're bringing everything they've got," Ethan muttered. He glanced at the Queen. "We can't hold this position." "Then we move," the Queen replied without hesitation. "Your ship's engines, can they still ignite?" Ethan blinked, startled by the question. "The engines, they're completely wrecked." "Not to fly," the Queen clarified, her eyes gleaming with an idea. "To burn." Ethan's mind raced. The engines were too damaged for flight, but their fuel cells still held enough volatile energy to create a firestorm if properly triggered. It was a risky plan. One wrong move, and the entire ship could blow. "It's a gamble," he said. The Queen stood, her posture regal despite the chaos. "Survival often is." Ethan nodded, rushing to the engine room with the Queen close behind. The savages' footsteps grew louder, their cries echoing through the narrow corridors of the ship. Reaching the engine console, Ethan accessed the manual override. Sweat dripped down his face as he bypassed safety protocols. The screen's flashing red. "If we ignite the engines, it'll create a massive backdraft," Ethan explained. "We'll have about 30 seconds to get clear before this place becomes a furnace." 30 seconds is enough," the Queen replied. "But what about your beacon?" "It's transmitting on a separate power source," Ethan said. "As long as the main core doesn't get fried, it'll keep going." Satisfied, the Queen turned to the doorway, where shadows danced against the walls. "Then we prepare to move." Ethan finished the override and armed the ignition sequence. A mechanical voice began a countdown. Engine ignition in 30 seconds. The savages burst into the corridor moments later, their leader roaring commands as they charge. Ethan fired his plasma pistol, the bolts lighting up the narrow space and dropping 2 of the attackers. The Queen moved like a whirlwind, her knife flashing as she disarmed and dispatched another savage with deadly precision. 20 seconds, the console announced. Ethan and the Queen retreated through the corridor, the savages hot on their heels. The ship shuddered as the engines roared to life, a deep rumble that shook the walls. The Queen led the way, her movements swift and calculated as they darted through the labyrinth of damaged corridors. As they neared the exit, the Queen stopped abruptly, her eyes narrowing. "They're circling around." Ethan swore under his breath. The savages had learned from their earlier mistakes and were trying to cut them off. The Queen grabbed a piece of broken piping from the floor, her grip firm as she handed it to Ethan. "Can you fight with this?" Ethan took the makeshift weapon, his expression grim. "Guess I'll find out." The two stood back to back as the savages closed in, their guttural cries filling the air. Ethan swung the pipe, deflecting a spear thrust and countering with a quick strike to the attacker's head. The Queen moved like a force of nature, her knife carving through the chaos with precision. 10 seconds, the mechanical voice warned. Ethan felt the heat building behind them as the engines reached critical levels. "We need to move. Now." With a final burst of effort, they broke through the line of attackers, sprinting toward the jungle. The Queen grabbed Ethan's arm, pulling him forward as the countdown reached its climax. 3, 2, 1. The ship's engines roared to full power, and a wave of searing heat erupted from the hull. The savages caught in the blast screamed as flames engulfed them, the firestorm consuming everything in its path. Ethan and the Queen dived behind a rocky outcrop just as the shockwave hit, the force of it knocking them to the ground. When the dust settled, Ethan peeked over the rocks. The ship was a smoldering ruin, its wreckage glowing with residual heat. The savages who had pursued them were either dead or fleeing, their forces decimated. Ethan turned to the Queen, who was breathing heavily but otherwise unharmed. "Remind me never to question your plans again." The Queen allowed herself a faint smile. "And remind me to trust humans more often." As they stood amidst the scorched jungle, a distant rumble filled the air, not from the wreckage, but from the sky. Ethan looked up and saw lights descending through the atmosphere. "Looks like your people got the message," he said. The Queen followed his gaze, her expression softening. "Let's hope they're in time." The lights grew closer, and for the first time since their ordeal began, Ethan felt a flicker of real hope. The tide had turned, but their fight wasn't over yet. The climactic rescue. The roar of descending ships filled the air, cutting through the lingering chaos of the smoldering wreckage. Ethan and the Queen stood amidst the destruction, their eyes fixed on the sky. Sleek vessels with silver hulls broke through the clouds, their engines humming with a distinct energy Ethan had never encountered before. They moved with precision, a stark contrast to the primal brutality of the savages that had hounded them. "That's Zenari technology," the Queen said, her voice tinged with relief and a trace of pride. "My people have arrived." Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was quickly tempered by reality. The savages, though battered, were regrouping in the distance. Their leader, a towering brute draped in scorched armor, bellowed orders. More of his warriors poured out of the jungle, their numbers swelling. They weren't retreating. They were preparing for one final assault. "They're not giving up," Ethan muttered, gripping his makeshift weapon tighter. His plasma pistol had run dry, and the odds were worse than ever. The Queen stepped forward, her regal bearing undiminished, despite the soot and blood that streaked her silver-blue skin. "They don't understand defeat. To them, surrender is death. They'll fight until there's nothing left." "Sounds familiar," Ethan quipped, though his tone lacked humor. He glanced at the descending ships. "How long until your people land?" "Minutes," the Queen said, her sharp gaze scanning the savages' movements. "But we don't have minutes." Ethan's heart sank. The Zenari rescue ships were precise, but they were slow to land, carefully avoiding the unstable terrain. Meanwhile, the savage horde was advancing rapidly, their war cries reverberating through the jungle. The Queen turned to Ethan, her violet eyes blazing with resolve. "We hold them here." Ethan blinked. "Hold them? With what?" "I'm out of ammo, and you're down to a knife." "Then we improvise," she said simply, picking up a discarded spear from a fallen savage. She tested its weight before glancing at him. Unless humans have a better idea. Ethan shook his head, a reluctant grin forming despite the situation. You're insane. I like that. Together, they moved to a defensible position near a cluster of jagged rocks, using the terrain to funnel the attackers into a narrow approach. Ethan scavenged what he could. Sharp debris, broken weapons, even vines from nearby trees. The Queen worked alongside him, her movements quick and efficient. The savages closed in, their guttural chants rising in intensity. At their forefront was the leader, his massive frame cutting an imposing figure against the flickering light of their torches. He carried a crude warhammer, its head stained with dried blood. "Looks like their boss wants a piece of us," Ethan muttered. The Queen didn't reply, her focus entirely on the approaching horde. When the first wave surged forward, she struck with deadly precision, her spear finding its mark in the chest of a charging savage. Ethan followed suit, swinging his makeshift weapon and knocking another attacker to the ground. The battle was chaotic and brutal. Ethan fought with everything he had, every swing of his weapon fueled by sheer determination. The Queen was a force of nature, her movements swift and calculated. Despite their exhaustion, they held their ground, their synergy an unspoken pact. But the savages kept coming. For every one they felled, two more took its place. Ethan's arms burned with exertion, and his vision blurred with sweat. The Queen, though tireless, was beginning to falter as well. The horde pressed closer, their sheer numbers threatening to overwhelm. And then the sky lit up. A brilliant beam of light shot down from one of the Zenari ships, striking the ground with a thunderous impact. The savages recoiled, their cries turning to screams as the beam carved a fiery path through their ranks. More beams followed, each one precise and devastating. The jungle erupted into chaos as the horde scattered, their confidence shattered by the sudden display of superior firepower. Ethan stumbled back, shielding his eyes from the blinding light. When he looked again, Zenari soldiers were descending from the ships, their sleek armor glinting in the glow of the beams. They moved with precision, their energy weapons cutting through the remaining savages like a hot knife through butter. One of the soldiers approached the Queen, dropping to one knee in deference. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice reverent, "we've come to bring you home." The Queen's expression softened, but she remained composed. "Secure the area," she ordered, "and see to the human. He is the reason I'm alive." The soldier glanced at Ethan, his gaze a mix of curiosity and respect. "Understood." As the Zenari forces mopped up the remnants of the savage horde, Ethan leaned against a rock, his body aching but his spirit lifted. The nightmare was finally over. The Queen approached him, her violet eyes meeting his. "You've done more than I could have asked for, Ethan Carter." Ethan managed a weary grin, all in a day's work. She extended her hand, and he shook it, feeling the weight of her gratitude in that simple gesture. "You will always have a place among the Zenari," she said. "You have my word." The sound of the rescue ships powering up filled the air as the Zenari forces prepared to depart. Ethan looked back at the smoldering wreckage of his ship and the jungle beyond. He had come to this planet by accident, but he was leaving as something more, a hero who had defied the odds and forged a bond with the Queen. As the Queen turned to board her ship, she paused and glanced back. "Ethan," she said, her voice softer now, "the galaxy could use more humans like you." Ethan chuckled. "Let's hope it never needs to." With that, she disappeared into the ship, and Ethan followed, stepping into the unknown. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to breathe freely. They had survived. They had won. But more than that, they had turned the tide, not just of a battle, but of a fate that had once seemed sealed. A new alliance. The Zenari flagship was a marvel of technology and artistry, a stark contrast to the primitive chaos of Varnis III. Its interior gleamed with polished silver and gold, and its halls resonated with a faint hum of advanced systems running seamlessly in the background. Ethan felt like an intruder in a world that wasn't his dirt-streaked boots leaving smudges on the immaculate floors. Beside him, the queen walked with effortless grace, her regal bearing restored in the safety of her domain. They were escorted to a grand chamber, its walls adorned with intricate carvings that seemed to tell the history of the Cenari people. Ethan felt the weight of 1,000 eyes on him, not literal, but the silent judgment of the soldiers and attendants who glanced at him with curiosity and skepticism. He could almost hear their unspoken thoughts. What is a human doing here? The queen, however, left no room for doubt. She stepped onto a raised platform at the center of the room, her voice ringing with authority. Let it be known that Ethan Carter, a human from Earth, risked his life to save mine. His courage and ingenuity turned the tide when all seemed lost. For that, he has my eternal gratitude. A murmur rippled through the gathered Cenari. Some nodded in approval, while others looked unconvinced. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, unused to such attention. He had saved the queen out of instinct and decency, not for recognition. Thanks, he said awkwardly, scratching the back of his neck. Just doing what anyone would have done. The queen turned to him, a faint smile playing on her lips. Humility suits you, Ethan, but don't underestimate the rarity of your actions. Many would have chosen the easier path. A tall Cenari male stepped forward, his golden armor gleaming under the chamber's soft light. He bowed deeply to the queen before addressing her. Your Majesty, we are relieved to see you safe. The traitors who orchestrated your capture will be brought to justice. The queen's expression hardened. See that they are. But first, ensure the survivors of Varnis III are given aid. The savages may be primitive, but they are not beyond redemption. Let this be a lesson that even those who fall from grace can rise again. The soldier nodded. As you command. Ethan watched the exchange with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. The queen's compassion surprised him. She had every right to condemn the savages for their brutality, yet she chose mercy. It was a trait he hadn't expected from someone who wielded such power. Once the chamber cleared, leaving only a handful of attendants, the queen turned her full attention to Ethan. You've been quiet. Ethan shrugged, just trying to take it all in. Your people, this ship, it's a lot for a guy like me. She studied him for a moment before gesturing for him to follow. They walked together through the ship's winding corridors, the queen dismissing the attendants with a wave of her hand. It was the first time they had been truly alone since their escape. You're wondering what happens next, she said, her tone gentle but direct. Ethan nodded. Yeah, that thought's crossed my mind. I mean, I don't exactly fit in here. The queen stopped in front of a large viewport that offered a breathtaking view of the planet below. Varnis III, scared but still vibrant, turned slowly beneath them. The stars beyond seemed to stretch infinitely, a reminder of how small and fleeting their struggles had been in the grand scheme of things. You've proven that humans are far from primitive, she said. Your courage and resourcefulness saved not only my life, but the stability of my people. You've earned a place among us, if you wish it. Ethan frowned, taken aback. A place among the Cenari. What does that even mean? The queen turned to face him, her violet eyes filled with something Ethan couldn't quite place. Respect, gratitude, perhaps even admiration. It means that you would be welcome in my court. As an advisor, a representative of humanity, or simply a friend. The choice is yours. The weight of her words hung in the air. Ethan hadn't expected this. He had spent most of his life exploring the edges of the galaxy, always on the move, never staying in one place for too long. The idea of belonging to something greater, of being part of an alliance that spanned star systems, was as thrilling as it was daunting. I appreciate the offer, he said after a long pause. Really, I do. But I'm not sure I'm cut out for royal courts and politics. I'm just a guy who happened to be in the right place at the right time. The queen smiled, a genuine warmth in her expression. Perhaps. But you've also shown that even the smallest actions can ripple outward, changing the course of history. Whether you realize it or not, Ethan Carter, you've already begun to leave your mark on the galaxy. Ethan looked out at the stars, his mind racing. He didn't know what the future held, but he couldn't deny that the events on Varnus 3 had changed him. He had seen what it meant to fight for something greater than himself, to stand against impossible odds and come out stronger. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "But for now, I think I'd just like a hot meal and a decent night's sleep." The Queen chuckled softly. "That I can arrange." As they stood together in the quiet of the ship, the vastness of the galaxy stretched out before them. Ethan felt something he hadn't in a long time. A sense of purpose. Whatever came next, he knew he wouldn't face it alone. And maybe, just maybe, he'd find a way to make the galaxy a little brighter, one impossible challenge at a time.